Welcome to the deep dive. Today we're jumping right into the whole U.S.-China trade situation.
Yeah, it's been moving fast.
Exactly. Those high-level talks just wrapped up in Geneva, and honestly, the stakes feel incredibly high right now, with President Trump's tariffs and then China's reactions really shaping things.
Absolutely. And think of this deep dive as your way to get a handle on what's really happening. We'll unpack the key developments, the potential shockwaves, and the different ways people are seeing this.
Without getting totally bogged down in the jargon, hopefully.
That's the plan. We're pulling from a pretty wide range of sources today.
Right.
Times of India, Al Jazeera, for that global view. Then U.S. perspectives from Fox News, PBS NewsHour, MSNBC, CBS, AP News, Politico.
Okay.
And also some analysis from the Roger Wiley Foundation Institute for Asia, plus summaries on the trade conflict itself and Trump's tariff policies specifically.
And you mentioned high stakes. I mean, we're not kidding, are we? Tariffs hitting, 145% on U.S. stuff going to China?
And 125% on Chinese goods coming into the U.S.
Yeah.
It's practically a near boycott level of taxation. Really puts the brakes on trade.
Okay, so let's start right there with those talks in Geneva. What actually went down on May 10th and 11th?
Right, so senior officials met for those 2 days. Afterwards, President Trump hit social media, sounding pretty upbeat.
Yeah.
Mentioned great progress.
Yeah.
Even floated this idea of 80% tariff seems right, which is quite a number.
80%? Wow. Okay, and what about others in the administration?
Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent also struck a positive note. He talked about substantial progress.
But vague.
Very vague, yeah. No real specifics given out yet. He promised a briefing on Monday, May 12th, so maybe more details then.
Okay, so cautious optimism, maybe, from the U.S. side. What was the vibe coming out of China?
Well, China's official news agency sounded quite a bit tougher. They stressed commitment to their core principles, basically rejecting anything that compromises those.
So not exactly mirroring the U.S. optimism there.
Not entirely. Although Vice Premier He Lifeng did describe the talks a bit more diplomatically. He called them candid and constructive.
Okay, candid and constructive. That's standard Diplo speak. Often.
It often is, yeah. But here's maybe the key tangible thing. They agreed to set up a new trade consultation mechanism.
A new channel for talks.
Exactly. And they also plan to release a joint statement that's also set for Monday, May 12th.
So mixed signals maybe, but at least they're agreeing to keep talking through this new mechanism. That feels significant.
It does, especially given how frosty things have been. It suggests the door isn't completely shut, even with the tough rhetoric.
Right. But to really get the weight of these talks, we kind of need to rewind and look at the policies that got us here. Trump's whole tariff strategy. What's the thinking behind these really steep taxes?
Well, Trump's initial plan had, two main parts. First was this idea of a flat 10% tariff on all imports from everywhere. And second, these extra reciprocal tariffs, mainly aimed at countries where the U.S. buys a lot more than it sells. Those were sort of paused initially, but the tariffs just on China have really ramped up.
And that's how we get to these huge numbers now.
Yeah, that combined 145% on Chinese goods coming in, which includes that big 104% tariff slapped specifically on Chinese electric vehicles recently.
Yeah.
I mean, these levels are just highly unusual in modern trade.
So what are the stated goals? Why do this?
Officially, it's about tackling the trade deficit with China. The gap between imports and exports.
Sure.
Another big one is trying to encourage U.S. companies to bring manufacturing back home, create jobs here.
Right, the reshoring argument.
Exactly. And finally, protecting American industries from what they call unfair competition. Things like predatory pricing, selling super cheap to kill competitors, and state subsidies from the Chinese government boosting their own companies.
And figures like Robert Lighthizer have been pretty central to this thinking, haven't they?
Oh, absolutely. He's described China as an existential threat. He really pushes for what he calls strategic decoupling.
Reducing the economic ties.
Yeah, basically making the economies less dependent on each other. And he sees high tariffs, maybe 50, 60%, or even more as the way to do it, to force a kind of balance, like maybe $150 billion in trade going each way, instead of the big imbalance now.
And Trump himself has often framed it simply as, making other countries pay for ripping us off.
That's been the rhetoric, yeah.
But what's the sort of standard economic take on how tariffs actually function? Who really pays?
Well, the broad consensus among economists is that tariffs are basically a barrier. They disrupt international trade, which ideally lets countries specialize and lowers prices for everyone.
Right.
Tariffs create what economists call a price wedge. It's like a gap opens up between what the seller gets and what the buyer pays.
So the price
Yeah.
is up for the buyer.
Usually, yes. Higher costs for whoever is buying the imported goods.
Yeah.
And potentially lower profits for the company selling them because the tariff eats into their margin or reduces demand. People like Paul Krugman have been pretty critical of the economic logic here.
So how does that price wedge, as you call it, actually hit, everyday Americans? What does it mean for the listener's wallet?
For you listening, yeah, the most direct effect is likely higher prices on lots of imported stuff you buy.
Like what kind of things?
Economist Mary Levely estimated it could cost the average household maybe $200 a month. You'd notice it most on things where the U.S. imports a lot of dollars. Shoes, toys, furniture, home goods, maybe some machinery parts, even ingredients for pharmaceuticals.
Huh. Even basic things.
Yeah, think about like a hamburger. The U.S. actually imports a lot of lean beef trimmings, right? Because our own cattle industry doesn't produce enough of that specific cut.
Really? Yeah.
So tariffs on those imported trimmings, that can push up the price of ground beef, and boom, your burger costs more.
So it ripples through in ways you might not expect.
And it's not just us at the checkout, right? What about, say, American farmers?
Oh, farmers get hit with kind of a double whammy.
How so?
First, China retaliates. They slap their own tariffs on American farm products, soybeans, pork, you name it.
Right. Tit for tat.
Exactly. So that cuts international demand for U.S. crops, hurts farmer sales and income. Second, farmers buy imported stuff too. Tractors, equipment, parts. Tariffs make all that more expensive, raising their costs.
And the uncertainty must be rough, too.
Huge. It's hard for them to plan long-term investments like planting more or buying new gear if they don't know whether these tariffs are temporary or here to stay. We've already seen China pivot, buying more beef from Brazil, for instance. And you might also see shortages, potentially, of things with low profit margins anyway, like blueberries or stuff we just don't grow much here out of season, or, Mexican beer, Scotch whiskey, things we primarily import.
I remember former Congressman Katie Porter talking about this pretty forcefully. Yeah, she was on MSNBC highlighting concerns about, ports potentially backing up, fewer goods on shelves, higher prices for families doing back-to-school shopping.
And the impact on workers.
Right, not just dock workers, but people in retail, she pointed out. That's a sector with many women, many mothers. She gave this example of a business importing Christmas items facing that massive 145% tariff.
What happens to them?
Potential layoffs, right? And Mary Lovely, the economist, made another key point. Okay, maybe tariffs create some jobs in protected sectors, like steel, perhaps.
Maybe.
But they could cost more jobs overall in other industries, like car manufacturing, because those businesses suddenly face higher costs for imported components. It's a trade-off, and many argue it's a net negative for jobs.
It does paint a pretty concerning picture, but we also hear the argument that this is all just strategy, a negotiating tactic. What's that perspective?
Right. Some Trump officials, like Commerce Secretary Howard Lutnick or Kevin Hassett at the National Economic Council, suggest these huge tariffs are mainly about creating leverage.
Leverage for what?
To force China to, quote, reboot the relationship. To get them to open up their markets more to American companies and exports. They sometimes point to the U.S.-UK trade deal, which has a baseline 10% tariff, as maybe a model for what a future deal could look like.
But is it clear what the end game is? Is it this decoupling Lighthizer talks about, or is it really about getting a better deal?
That's still pretty murky, actually. Tony Sage at the Rajawali Foundation points out just how unpredictable Trump's approach to China can be. Is the main focus grinding down China's economy, or is it ultimately about striking some kind of grand new trade agreement? It's hard to say for sure.
And China's not just sitting still, presumably.
No, definitely not. They seem to be preparing for ongoing friction. They have this dual circulation policy.
What's that mean?
Basically boosting their own domestic economy, getting Chinese people to buy more Chinese goods, and pushing hard on homegrown technology and innovation.
So becoming less reliant on exports.
Partly, yeah. But also diversifying who they trade with, strengthening ties with other countries, and maybe even routing exports through third countries to try and get around U.S. tariffs. They're adapting.
And what's the hit to China's economy from all this? Is it hurting them?
It seems to be. UBS analysts estimated these tariffs could knock about 1.5% off China's growth.
That's not insignificant.
No, especially when they're already dealing with major problems in the real estate sector and high debt levels. Oxford Economics even projected trade with the U.S. could fall by like 70%.
Yeah.
So yeah, there are definitely economic consequences on their side too.
And layered on top of all the economics, there's this whole national security angle that gets brought up.
Absolutely. People like Lighthizer frame tariffs as essential for U.S. security. They talk about China's military expansion, espionage concerns, intellectual property theft. So from that perspective, reducing economic dependence on China is seen as a strategic imperative, regardless of the economic cost. But, there's always that debate. Does more trade help prevent conflict? Or does economic tension actually make conflict more likely? Experts disagree on that.
Okay, so as we wrap up this deep dive, what are the absolute key things for our listeners to take away from all this?
Well, I think number one is that the U.S. and China did just talk in Geneva. They're seeing substantial progress, and they've agreed on this new consultation platform. That's something.
But the details are missing.
Totally missing, especially on whether those sky-high tariffs might actually come down. We're all kind of waiting for that Monday briefing to see if there's any real substance there.
And the second thing?
Just the ongoing debate about the impact of these tariffs. Is it a necessary tool for economic nationalism and security, as proponents argue? Or is it mainly hurting American consumers and businesses, as critics contend? The effects are real, but how you weigh them is really the core of the argument.
It's definitely complex, and it feels like it's changing constantly. So for you, listening right now, as you think about all these different angles of the politics, the economics, the potential fallout, what do you see as the most likely path forward here?
How do you think this will shake out?
And maybe more importantly, what kind of impact do you think it'll have, or is already having, on your own life, your community, and just the global economy in general? This story is far from over.
Not at all. Monday's details, if they come, will be really crucial for figuring out this next chapter.
Definitely something to keep watching. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive.